Great. Welcome, everyone. We're going to give it a few minutes for all participants to log in. And thank you for joining us today. Okay, as soon as we hit 90, we'll get, there we go. It's loading up, went past 90. All right, so in the interest of time, let's get started. So obviously we all know what we're here to talk about. And I do want to say this, Spanish is my first language. For some reason, sometimes I say Log4j. It just happens. So I apologize. I fully understand what this is. Trust me, after the last, 10 days or whatever so it's been, I'll never forget either. But sometimes I transpose those, so please be patient with me. So welcome to all of you out there. We really appreciate you spending time with us. We know that you have a lot of other things you could do this morning, especially on a Monday morning before the holiday, but we appreciate it. So my name is George Gerchow. I'm the Chief Security Officer at Sumo Logic. Along with me is Roland Palmer. Roland Palmer is our VP of Global Operations, and we'll talk about what that means a little bit. But let's get to the next slide. And I said the thank yous up front, but this is mainly also for our customers as well too. The patience that the industry has shown over the course of the last 10 days or so has just been incredible. When this first hit, I think it was, really hit, was right around December 10th. A lot of us have had to scramble in a lot of different ways and try to see what this means. And it hasn't stopped. And by the way, it's not going to stop. This is going to continue to just go and affect our community for a while. So it's a real opportunity, though, for us to try to work together and be patient and make sure that, all of us try to find a solution and just inform each other. This is one of the things I love about the era of security that we're in today, is this era of transparency. So Girish, who's also joining us as well too, he's a VP on our marketing side of the house, very knowledgeable. When we were all coming up in this industry, security people never talked. It was always like, put the skeletons in the closet, say no, block everything. And it's changed. We're getting to a point now where we're really communicating a lot more, and that's going to help us stay a few steps ahead of what the bad actors are doing today. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's just a quick agenda. We're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about Log4j and what it is, how you can know if you're impacted. We're going to talk about a little bit of the advantage of a cloud native architecture and moving out to the cloud. I believe this hasn't been addressed enough as a community. Incident response. So we're going to go through what we've done so far. We worked all weekend long, by the way, and we'll talk about why. This was 2 weekends in a row, and then a lot of nights last week, especially Roland and his team with engineering. And then we're going to talk about the product itself and some of the things that those of you as customers already know that you can do to mitigate the vulnerability, as well as some of you that are maybe prospects that are interested in how Sumo can help out. Some resources moving forward. So Girish and team have done just a fantastic job of putting together an incident response center that's external, and then some detailed capabilities on how to actually make all this happen via queries and strings that you can look for. And then we'll open up the Q&A, which is my favorite part. So I want to hear from you, questions that you may have, anything that may be forward thinking or looking back at the past is always welcome. So we'll talk about those in the Q&A as well too. Okay, so let's get down to the facts and what happened. So, again, one of the things I do want to point out here too, and Roland, if you don't mind going to the next slide, is this hopefully doesn't give open source a black eye. Open source has been around for a long time. We all leverage it, and we should continue to leverage it. And so when this first came out, and it really hit, like when I said, like right around December 10th or so, the open source community had already identified it. And so they had identified it a while back. And it really wasn't until it hit a certain game, which we're going to talk about here in a second, that people really started to pay attention to it. And so, what it really is, at its simplest level, is something that was released by Apache to be able to do deep, logging. And so if you look at that bottom bullet point, over 3 billion devices are using Log4j. That's insane. And some of the top software companies in the world as well, too. And so this is something, that was methodically thought out. This is the way of the world today, right? Supply chain, things are going to be unfortunately distributed at mass, and bad actors are getting more and more creative about it. And so to really be able to do this is that RCE, or remote code execution, unauthorized, that now people can actually take data and then pump it in externally through Log4j to really just wreak havoc amongst organizations. The main thing that we've seen out there is a lot of folks using it for Bitcoin mining, which is getting harder and harder as compute resources are getting slimmed down, with people starting to lock down their environments, public repositories like Git and everything else. And so they're going to get more and more creative to be able to make money off of this. Next slide, please. And so, when this was released and put out there, it's so funny how many times we've had to update this slide, and unfortunate. We went from older versions, which were really vulnerable, I think like from 2.0 of Log4j to 2.14. And then next thing you know, 2.15 became vulnerable. 2.16, as we found out, over the course of the weekend, was vulnerable to DOS attacks. And so we've just been playing, like everyone else, a game of catch up, So we believe, as our platform, which we'll talk about in a second, the risk exposure and chances of exploitation were limited. But at the same time, everyone has to do their due diligence and patch, So we literally updated this slide yesterday to say 2.17. Because that's the latest version that's out. And the community as a whole is going to continue to expect this to continue to increase with each version that's being released out there today. And so right now it is a game of catch up, and being able to make sure that you successfully get the latest version out there, and then understand from a backward compatibility perspective what the risks were with each version. And so it's a game to patch right now for everyone. And I'm sure all of you are feeling this that are on this call today. So we're going to continue to stay all over it, but continue to do your updates and checks to make sure that you're on the latest version itself. Next slide, please. So this is the funny part again, and I mentioned this in the beginning. This was actually identified in November. And once it was identified and the open source community started bringing this up, folks were just slow to pay attention to it. And it wasn't until it really started hitting the Minecraft servers, again, mainly around Bitcoin mining, that people started paying attention to it. And I love this for multiple reasons. Like one thing is the fact that I've always believed that all of you out there that have kids, or all of you that may play Minecraft today, it's, the future of engineering. It gives you an engineering mindset, and then it leads off into other games like Fortnite as well too. For those of you that play Fortnite, getting higher ground and starting to build up like that, that came from a DNA of Minecraft. And so that's when it was really exposed. That's when people started paying attention to it. But there's definitely, evidence out there that the exploitation happened, far before that as well too, at least 9 days. And I'm starting to see stuff now 2 weeks before that. And so this is going to go on and on and on again. But, we also need to start paying attention when these volunteer coders and people put stuff in the open source community. When they believe that they find things, I think we have to react a little bit quicker to that. And that's one of the areas of improvement as an industry that we could have done. So that's a lot of the what it is, when, and how. I'm going to take a big pause now and see, Roland, if you have any comments or anything that you think I missed along that journey.
No, one thing, I just circling back to the very first slide, Georgia, thank you. I want to say thank you to all the security practitioners out there who don't get the opportunity to hear it. Those who are actually in the fight, midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, filtering through thousands and thousands of alerts, separate from Log4j, that we know what it looks like. Those folks still in the fight who don't get to hear the thank you, I just want to make sure that they get the proper thank you if they don't get to hear it. Aside from that, I'm right in line with everything you said.
Great. And there's some questions coming in too, Roland. And so one of them that's a really good question is there a list of attacks that exploit the Log4j vulnerability? I think your team has got a pretty good list, and especially from a logging perspective of what to look for, which we've also, was published out there a while back, but I'd love to get your thoughts around that.
Yeah, so it's going to be tough to have a comprehensive list because, like you mentioned before, this is ever developing. So the community seeing everything from reverse bash shells to botnets to like you mentioned before, coin miner, and of course, without a doubt, Trojan attacks as well. But a comprehensive list of attacks or attack types is going to be pretty tough until we get closer to the maintenance side of this vulnerability.
Great. And for those of you that are putting questions in, we appreciate this already. I mean, we're only about a good 11 minutes in and we're getting quite a few in, and I kind of like to make it interactive like this. So hopefully you guys are okay with this. Another one, which I know that we'll get to, so let's save this one, talking about insights and alerts, but keep on pumping those questions in. Next slide, please, Roland. So are you impacted? And this is the biggest thing that everyone's asking today is, have I been impacted? And we had a little bit of a scare this weekend. I already mentioned this side of it, so version 2.0 or later. And look, I'll be, again, completely transparent. I fully expect 2.17 to also have issues. I just do. We knew when we released our latest collector and we started updating our assemblies, which I'll talk about in a second, that we were going to see this continue on. I think this was just so crafty and embedded in so many software supply chains today that a lot of us are going to be impacted, and this is going to go on and on, like I mentioned before. Next slide, please. And so I think one of the important things when you start looking at this is, what does your architecture look like, and what do you want it to look like moving forward? We are lucky, so at Sumo Logic, we're very lucky that we do have a cloud native architecture. We were born and bred in AWS 12 years ago. We're a multi-tenant solution, which there's always been arguments. Like, I did security at VMware before coming to Sumo. And one of the things that attracted me to it was, I want to be somewhere that's multi-tenant. I believe that that's the future of cloud architecture. And I want to be part of securing that and getting that trust from our customer and prospects. But the thing that attracted it to me the most, working at places like VMware, coming from finance, coming from the government, is the lack of standardization. That's so hard to do. And I'm not pointing the finger at anyone because I came from this too. But when you have lack of standardization when it comes to architecture, it's really hard to detect, deploy, and figure things out like this, because you're all over the place. You may be in a hybrid environment that's got, a mixture of on-premise type stuff out there that you have to currently support, which makes it extremely difficult to detect and then mitigate threats like this. And so the fact that we are cloud native, the fact that that architecture is all standardized on Ubuntu, makes this not easy, but easier. It gives you a good idea of how your assemblies are built out, and then what it is that you really need to do from an action perspective to go out there and take care of it. I think the biggest challenge that we'll have, and Roland and I will discuss this in a second, is comms once we get to IR. Next slide, please.
Hey, George, it's Girish. Sorry, I wanted to jump in. There is there is a generic question that got posted. That is, can you share a few examples of the companies that were affected by this vulnerability? I thought it's good to level set so that this doesn't sound like, hey, a solution providers talking that we need to address this. So could you comment on that, sir?
Yeah, pretty much everybody, from Apple to Microsoft. I mean, people don't realize this, but Minecraft is owned by Microsoft, and so the list just goes on and on and on and on. I mean, I can't personally think of a tech company that has not been affected by this, or fintech and, healthcare. Anyone who's leveraging, open source and has a CI/CD pipeline built out, even when it comes to 3-tiered apps, you're going to get affected by this. I think the biggest part of that question, though, Girish, is who knows? We got criticized a little bit in the beginning because of lack of response. We did respond day one, but we knew right away. I mean, this started like in Poland. and Roland will tell you this, so our SRE team is mainly out of Poland. We got a really good hacker team out of there as well too, that does system security. So a big shout out to them. They were the ones that originally identified this with part of Roland's GOC, which sits there too. And I think the bigger part of the question, so number one, just about everybody. I can't think of many people who weren't. But the second part of that question is who knows? Like that's the hardest part is most people are probably like, oh my gosh, does this affect us or not? And they don't even know where to start because a lot of times software inventory and assets doesn't include open source. It includes everything that we procure and not things that are freeware. And so to me, uncovering that and understanding where you could have been impacted and then the risk around that is the hard part. I was going to dive right into this, but that's such a good question. And whoever asked that in the audience, we really appreciate that. Roland, to get your thoughts, because obviously, your prior military, you came from these massive NOC type environments. Looking at the past of where you came from and then where you're at now, how hard do you think that would have been to discover where you were and then, like what we did here at Sumo?
So previous places, and again, having that military background, being largely on-prem, and you talk about accountability of assets, not just asset inventory, but accountability of assets, of having that kind of soup to nuts perspective of everything that you have in your workloads. To answer your question directly, it's likely, and this isn't a shot at any company or anyone like that, but I'd probably still be working on it if I if I was still on-prem. And it wasn't so much because of the capability set, it was because of the knowledge base where the desperate workloads and the information containing them were held with the just distributed teams that owned them and not a centralized place, going back to that GOC function that you talk about, that GOC that we talk about. So the complexity of having one, a cloud native architecture, two, having a central organization to kind of manage and have that information available to them allows the reaction time to be exponentially more efficient. And if I were to say there's a gap anywhere, it's again, knowing what's defined inside of those workloads. Where's everything at? And what are you having from an open source perspective or otherwise?
Yeah, and it's facts, which leads us to this, when you look at this graphic, and I really like this graphic because this is where the world's heading to, and fortunately for us, where we're at. So now you have this DevOps, community or mindset to where you're moving rather rapidly, deploying these different workloads, and especially a SaaS-based, native SaaS-based solution like ours, where we're in this continuous delivery mindset. So one of the great things, and our customers will tell you this, like whenever we go to share a roadmap, is things that we pretty much already done because it's there the next day, and that's the beauty of this too. So going back to your on-premise comments, Roland, before, like even like if you take 10 years ago or whatever, when people were using Exchange on-premise, and there was a patching cycle because of a vulnerability, it was really tough because you had to sort of identify all the pieces, components to it, roll it out through that entire infrastructure, what all the different versioning and everything was. And when you're in the cloud, you're no longer in that mindset. And this is part of really knowing the shared responsibility model and that your cloud provider is doing this stuff in the background. We went through it with AWS as well too, when it came to things like Meltdown and Spectrum a couple of years ago as well. So we're taking care of our part of the shared responsibility model through that continuous delivery piece and the patches of the assemblies, which we'll talk about here in a second. The other piece of this too is, once applications are starting to be built off of microservices, this is where the value of development and security working together really fit in nicely, and IT, because now, you have capabilities like monitoring, tracing, metrics and observability to not only understand how workloads can perform better or the most optimized, but also as a security person, I want to know what those components are. I want to know how APIs interact. And I also want to be able to detect, not only from an observability perspective, when a component may be at risk for performance, but also from a security perspective, because those things are tied in so well together. So having that common visibility through logging and analytics is critical. And then finally, containers. And this is where we, this weekend, that's where the flag was raised a little bit too, which we'll talk about. For those of you that are customers of ours, AWS made some notifications this week, talking about certain patterns of traffic that they saw. And for us, it was on the container stack, which we've worked really hard on to maintain secure through our Kate stack. But there was some, DNS type traffic that we saw internally that we had to deal with this weekend. It was nothing that was exploited, but something that was sort of raised to our attention. And so, I'm going to give kudos to AWS for raising that. I thought it was pretty cool that they were able to see that. But then at the same time, I think things could have been a little bit more helpful as far as like timing and more information as to what they saw. And so I think we have to get better about that as a community. But this cloud native architecture really helped us, again, sort of react to that. So a few things I want to talk about here. Number one, what is a GOC? A lot of you are probably like, what is he talking about? So it's a global operations center. We believe that the future of operations response lies in combining IT and security. So back when we all came up, there was a NOC, Network Operations Center, and then a Security Operations Center. I've never understood why we didn't combine those two things. Because whenever there is a outage or availability problem, the first thing that IT does, or the NOC does, is contact the SOC and say, hey, did you guys make a firewall change? Vice versa, whenever there is a security event that comes in, you usually go over to the NOC and say, okay, what's taking place? How are things operating? Did you guys make a change over on the IT side that affected us? By combining those two functions, not only do you reduce costs by having the same type of tooling and platforms that you make a bet on, but it's also efficiency when it comes to responding to this. And we saw that in full display at Sumo over the course of the last 10 days or so, where we were all working off of the same information, not being siloed, and attacking this problem head on. So, kudos to Roland's team, who's the Global Operations Center. Speed, this is the biggest thing, is getting to the root cause of the problem quickly, understanding if you were exploited or not, understanding where you were vulnerable, and then starting to have communication around that, which we'll talk about towards the end of this. Deployment. So from day one, minute one, our assembly started getting to the newer versions of Log4j. What is an assembly? That's a set of configuration items that are put together by developers to be able to deploy software. So it's preset. And yes, in some instances, Log4j was part of our assemblies. So we had to update those across the board. But again, because we have a standardized multi-tenant cloud infrastructure, it was easier for us to identify that than it was for me back in my days at VMware and be able to deploy those. And then the rapid updates, so getting everyone together, making sure that we did this, as quickly as possible was absolutely key.
Hey, George, I want to follow up on that, what you just mentioned. So in other words, the siloed SOC, NOC, IT ops, and other physical security kind of functions are all together in this new GOC, right? That's
correct. So, and the other thing I'll mention around that too, Girish, is that, when I was coming up in this space many, many years ago, I was in IT before there was even security. It was more of a risk management department. We sort of had to kind of do security as being IT. When security started reporting up to a CIO, and I always had a little bit of, I wouldn't say heartburn. I sort of understood it because availability was everything. But the problem is all of a sudden you would roll out these services and then afterwards be like, oh, well, we forgot about security. You guys need to bolt that on now, patch that. And then all of a sudden security would want to patch that, and the line of business owner, let's say it was finance, HR, marketing, whatever it would be like, no, we can't patch that right now, because if you patch it, or if you make us change like DB passwords and those things, it might blow things up. And so we constantly were reacting as security because of availability. We're starting to see a shift now to where availability is still important. Like for you to run a business, it's got to be available, but it has to have seamless security. And I believe the only way to do that at scale moving forward is to now reverse those roles and have IT reporting into security. So then that way we can provide the guardrails. We want to still move in an agile fashion at the velocity that developers want to move at, but it's got to be that mix of the two. And we've seen this with supply chain attacks over and over and over again, where there's something that's available, but it's not secure. So thank you for asking that question. Okay, so let's get into the IR piece. So this is the most interesting and probably the most fun thing about it. And when I say fun, Roland knows that this is true. For us, this is what we live for. This is what we do. So if you don't mind going to the next slide, let's start kind of looking at some of the details behind this. So the first thing is coordination. And what does this really look like? So when you're working with cloud service providers, you got to get them involved early. And fortunately for us, I'm going to give AWS another compliment here. They were communicating immediately through Slack from day one. They were like, this is what we're seeing. This is what's happening on your infrastructure side of it. So again, the shared responsibility model. When we start taking it to the AMI and above, this is where Roland's team really had to step in. And we used like a combination of PagerDuty, Slack, several other things to make sure that comms were working well internally. And we had to really coordinate cross-functionally, right? Because I mentioned the SRE team before, the site reliability engineers who work heavily in our AWS environment, our architecture team, which was awesome to really fully, again, understand where this could be vulnerable within our architecture, where we actually had Log4j going on, and then the communications. And one of the things I'll say about communications before I hand it off to Roland to talk about communication and workflows in these three pieces is we love keeping executives out of it. And Roland really loves this as well too. Look, when I was coming up, again, in finance was the worst, and I'd be in a traditional data center, there'd always be like myself, and I came up through the networking side, myself and another network engineer working on a problem, and we'd have like 30 or 40 executives, and I'm not exaggerating, on a phone, like listening for communication while they were out golfing, while they were out eating dinner or doing whatever else. Useless. Did you try this? Did you try that? We don't do that at Sumo. Like, we escalate just the information that they need to know, and then they can opt in to Slack channels to see what's happening. Now, obviously, some of our executives, like our founder, Christian Bijan, is on the CTO side. He's technical. I'm so proud of him. You know why? Because he stayed out of this. He realized that with the people that we had involved and seeing through the Slack channel what was being done, there wasn't a million, did you try this, did you try that? And so that communication is very important in limiting the amount of information on a need-to-know basis for the people that were actually working on it. Then at the same time, we're exposing a lot of this to the company so people can relate to customers, which, again, thank you to our customers, and then other folks out there as to what's taking place. I'm going to say one more thing, and I'm going to hand it off to Roland. One of the things that we also have to, I guess, get better about, and a lesson that we learned too, is there is this desire to learn and desire to know. And so, as this went on, we got better about opening this up to all Sumos, which I think is something that we're going to do moving forward, because people are starved for understanding some of the details behind what's going on. And I think that we're going to do that more and more. But Roland, why don't you give us your perspective as well too, as being the VP of the Global Operations Center on these 3 bullet points.
Yeah, and George, for the record, we don't even like to involve you whenever possible. So no, but I want to double click on the GOC, the GOC, that Global Operations Center. Like you mentioned, from day-to-day basis, IT operations, NetOps, security operations, with a dash of DevSecOps. That's what we are. That's what the GOC is. During its response, it kind of leverages all of those different capabilities to serve as command and control for instance, especially this one, obviously, for communicating, prioritizing, all of that happens centralized in the GOC. So diving specifically into Log4j, particularly for this vulnerability, the GOC served as not necessarily C2 or command and control at first. It was chaos management, like I'd imagine a bunch of other folks experienced too, where we kind of forgot that we have this centralized portion or piece that does incident response. So let's go ahead and exercise this. This is what we do, reminding folks that this is what we do. This is how we'll work through it. This is the main effort. This is supported if you've ever heard kind of those military aspect of things. And then making sure we're handling everyone's desires to help. And that's another tough piece. Everyone wants to help for a major thing like this. Having a GOC, again, that central place for information in C2 is really important. And then in something as broad reaching as Log4j, we need to make sure that all the value from everywhere, from all those formerly disparate activities, all that value is getting pushed to the right place. So with that, again, talking coordination, we start pulling together the right people and teams, making sure we level set on an understanding, making sure everyone across the company, all the teams across the company understand what the problem is and what we're trying to solve for, and then making sure we're dialed in and focused on that effort. And then that coordination piece becomes easier as time moves along. And as time moves along, you start to see that grind, like you talked about, the late hours, the system security team working through things, everyone working together kind of in this well-oiled machine, except with Log4j, when you get updates on Friday, the past 2 Fridays of what's happening. And towards communication, what a robust and dynamic thing. With Log4j specifically, with Sumo Logic, talking about Sumo Logic, we had interested customers. We had interested external stakeholders. we had interested internal stakeholders. And then we had the rest of the company who may not be interested, but are absolutely impacted. And what I'm talking about there is that in our personal lives, we may not realize what we're using in Log4j. And let's not forget COVID that sent a bunch of people working remote. What we're dealing with now, we have a bunch of endpoints working on a stack that's remote, and we may not be in the right place. So again, towards communication, it was really dynamic. We did it really, really well. And fortunately, we had a GOC to do it. And it took a bunch of great people to include our marketing friends to remind us how to do it. Even our chief architect to help us craft how to talk internally and tell people, hey, this is the impact, kind of walk it down. So a bunch of major contributions into the GOC to kind of deliver that coordination, that workflow management, and that communication.
Agreed. Thanks, Roland. Next slide, please. And I think those workflows, that we've been working on for a long time really apply too with all the acquisitions, that we've recently had as well. Because, it's no longer just one family. Like as you make acquisitions, you start integrating them in, those same workflows, those same playbooks apply. Let's get to the next one because I want to talk about something that's very important here. Our brand new president of go-to-market said something day one that has stuck with us, which is be brilliant at the basics. I think a lot of times, when something like this happens, you cast the net too wide. And so what we did was we looked at 4 things and we said, these are going to be the 4 things that we're going to be really good at throughout this entire process. And it happened again this week. The first one is a Sumo Logic service. And so as much as we boast about multi-tenancy and what that means, and the fact that we can scale and scan exabytes of data a day, which we do, and I just says exabytes, this was the first place that we had to start without a doubt, because if there is ever someone that's compromised, does that lead to another tenant being compromised? And then does it go on and on and on? So we really have to look at our service first. And that, again, this is the crown jewels. And so, we had to make sure that we were never impacted. We're going to take a look at and see where we really using Log4j, to be able to invoke custom lookups, because that's what this is all about. Again, bringing in external data, which could drive malware throughout your environment. And come to find out, we had some custom code in there that our architecture team had built out for that functionality. And again, this is where people could say, oh my God, what is that custom code? And let's get deep into that. Custom code is a necessary thing, because you got to be able to build and architect things at scale. And especially for us, being born and bred in the cloud way before other companies were, we had to apply a lot of custom code because it simply didn't exist. And everyone's software supply chain looks this way. So we're still patching though and updating those assemblies I talked about before, those configuration items that are deployed as part of our workloads and upgrades to the service. The second piece was the installed collectors, because this affected our customers. And so we've had 3 new versions released. This isn't going to stop anytime soon. But some things that you can do, and that last bullet point is the big one. Validating with a third-party penetration test doesn't hurt. And, penetration test sounds nice. We run bug bounties against these things because we want to make sure that not only, our team and then, our folks in Europe, which I talked about before in Poland, which are straight up hardcore hackers, we know our collectors inside and out, but sometimes it may be possible you can overlook something. So having a third-party verification around it, I think, is really important to be able to do that, just in case there's something that you miss when it comes to exposure. The other thing I want to mention too for our customers is that this piece is so important about how the risk was significantly reduced because of the way we use it. We use it for internal auditing only. That's it. So there was really no way for someone to be able to bring in an external piece to Log4j to truly exploit what was happening on the collector side. Supply chain inspection, and this is not going to go away, and this is where the industry has got to get better. We started inspecting, just like you did us, all of our trusted partners, all of our vendors out there to see how they were using it. Our responses back were terrible. We probably had 18% of 300 plus apps respond. And most of the time they were saying, hey, look, we're just dealing with it. We're trying to patch. We don't know. And so we're digging really hard into that because this is also for you, our community out there, to make sure that everyone is in line and doing what we did when it came to this. But again, what I would say to them, being our peers, which, we take a lot of phone calls, is try to take this and make it basic, so like 4 areas of focus was almost even too much. I wanted to make it 3, but it had to be these 4. And then finally, open source, so a lot of our collector releases obviously sit in Git and other public repositories out there. So we had to go out there, look at those footprints, and then update that to the latest version as well too, which we're continuing to do moving forward. But we're not going to step away from this. Like, this is going to be, as this continues to move forward, the 4 areas of focus that we're going to have. And again, trying to be brilliant at the basics. Roland, I don't know if you have any comments around that, but this is where we put the majority of our work into.
Yeah, and the internal team spent a lot of times committing to this. Questions that we had internally from our customers were, you put out a new installed collector. Why? And that's because we want, like you mentioned before, we want folks to stay as up to date as possible. You talk about risk and wanting to minimize that. And because it's not necessarily risky to us, it may be risky to our customers. So we want to make sure that they have it in a way that is most up to date and as least vulnerable as possible as we can put out there and as close to real time as we can get. So the value there is that, like everyone else, we're chasing Log4j and we're trying to stay in front of it as much as possible. We're going to keep pushing those updates out as we get more information.
And big shout out to our collector team. Like, this isn't easy for this team to continually release these. Again, part of our messaging was, the risk is minimal, but that's not good enough for a lot of people. And I understand they want to see us on the latest version. So our collector team is continuing to work on this. We'll have an eye on it and continue to move forward with this. Next slide, please. So published resources. So these are areas that you can go to start seeing some of the work that we've done out there. And again, these links, really important for you guys to go out there and check these out. But, our collector release notes, which talks about the different versioning out there, our best practices on how to upgrade these different collectors, so whether it's through, the actual UI itself or through the CLI, a lot of information that we have put out there to really help out our customers. And again, we're transparent. We're going to tell people exactly what's going on internally and what the next step should be. With future comms, we may get something wrong at some point, but I believe that communication and over communicating is the right thing to do. And that's where we've, leaned into. Instead of not saying anything, instead of not doing anything, we're going to give you the best guidance that we can at the time, and then reorient and shift if we have to. Kind of going back to that OODA loop, Roland, it's kind of funny how this fits in here. Blogs on situational awareness and action that you can take around the CVE article itself, and the vulnerability. And then, one of the biggest things too is that last one. If you're not motivated now more than ever to digitize your workloads and move out to the cloud, I don't know what's going to do it. This is the time now to start taking that step and truly start standardizing. There's inflection points, throughout history when it comes to tech that we've had an opportunity to do this. Now, I'll give you again, you guys know that I came from VMware. I've said this multiple times. That was a big one because I felt like when people were going from P to V, they had a real chance to start doing the things we've always wanted to do around defense in depth, IT hygiene on what services are running on these boxes, but nope. What most people did was just went right from P to V with the same stuff running on these boxes. Cloud is a real inflection point to make things simple and see what services are running out there that we may no longer need. Containers do that for us as well too. So, that blog is pretty good on starting to describe some of that and start motivating people more to be able to invest into cloud and cloud service providers. And I'll argue this all day long. I have no regrets about coming to Sumo and some of the work that we've done internally to really start being thought leaders around here. Is it perfect? No. But do we move at a velocity that I haven't seen anywhere else? Yes.
George and Roland, sorry, I was just going to jump in and request, there are several questions that have been posed related to, hey, has Sumo provided a query? And I think it would be remiss on our part if we don't do a quick double click and perhaps even have Roland click on the situational awareness brief, just to give a sense, George, if it's okay with you and Roland to say what's there and what people can expect.
Absolutely. Roland, if you don't mind bringing that up. So here's another really cool and fascinating thing about drinking your own champagne, and I will not say dog fooding. When you use your product in this way, these are actually queries and strings that cross-functionally we use to determine if we were, under attack, where we were vulnerable, what areas we had to look at first. And again, there's that famous JNDI string there. But Then we take it a little bit further with hunting opportunities as well too, to be able to get more proactive about this. So there's definitely a lot of guidance here. And again, kudos to Girish and a lot of the team that put this together cross-functionally. You know, our systems engineers, sales engineers who are incredible, customer success, and everyone else, our spec ops team, who's deep into security. So again, they come from 3-letter agencies and different locations who really help put this together. And so we've been releasing this slowly. As this thing matures, we've matured. And we've started looking more in depth at what some of these queries could look like and some of these strings could look like. So this is all accessible to you today, customers and prospects. And again, this is drinking our champagne. And you can see, I love the way that this is laid out. Basic, and then advanced, and just getting deeper and deeper into some of the things you can do using, again, our own product to be able to detect this. And some of this, by the way, came from partners and customers too. You know, where early on, like these massive enterprises were like, hey, Sumo, we know you guys know everything, but here you go. And some of that was extremely valuable. We have no pride. And Roland will be the first one to tell you that. We learn from our customers all the time and in how they use our own products, which I love that. And then obviously it takes it all the way down to patching now. But great point, Girish. You know, we have a lot of deep data here on how you can start leveraging our product and the combination of products to be able to go out and start protecting yourself, detecting and then protecting your environment against this.
Thank you.
Anything to add, Roland?
No, I mean, the partnership with both our customers and our partners to kind of collate this information was phenomenal. And again, going back to the content team, the spec ops team who continue to deliver this content, absolutely phenomenal.
Yep, and a couple people on your team too.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. There are a couple of questions around spec ops and others. Yeah, that's a key part of Sumo's service. And I know that slide had quite a bit of information. Thanks, Roland and George. So if you are a Sumo customer, reach out to us, support@sumologic.com. And there's tons of information to get you started already that's published in our documentation, as well as the vulnerability response center webpage that we recently launched. Back to you guys.
Yeah, again, it's good cross-functional stuff, Roland. If you don't mind going to the next slide. You know, we had several people on Roland's team as well too with DevOpsy backgrounds. You know, Natalia, you know, comes from a DevOps background, just really patrolling our AWS environment, working constantly with engineering. You know, Dan Shady, want me to give a shout out as well too. You know, that came more from the SOC side, that was, you know, working with developers, putting together a lot of these queries and strings, and then, you know, obviously spec ops as well too. So cross-functional effort, communication, workflows, playbooks that we've designed really helped us out. So not a scare tactic, but I guarantee you, this is not going to go away. And it's going to continue to rise. And that supply chain piece that I mentioned before, inspect your supply chain. I've been saying this for 2 years. It's not going to stop. You know, you're only as strong as your possible weakest link in your supply chain. And no offense to anyone, I never, you know, like you guys obviously know we compete with Splunk. I don't want to see Splunk get hacked ever. You know, you know, this is more of a good guy, bad guy type thing. And so, but inspect that supply chain, see what the vendors are that you're using are doing, how they're reacting, how transparent they're being. And then, you know, obviously also what their products can do to help you out here, because a lot of people are putting out solutions out there. Next slide, please. So now we're going to start getting, you know, again, sharing some of these resources out there and some of the things that we're going to continue to do moving forward. We're not going to stop with comms. So we're going to continue to talk about, you know, what's coming out there. That's an internal Slack channel just for your education, where we're communicating with our collector team to be able to see what the releases are that they're doing, what they're working on. So again, this is the advantage of being a, you know, modern DevSecOps shop. We have full visibility into what our developers are doing, working with them, providing guardrails to see where those collector releases are. Again, even though our prior collectors were minimal risk, we're going to continue to update to the latest version just to give people that sense of comfort out there and make sure that we're doing our due diligence. Our customer support, customer success team has been amazing. You know, just working with folks. I've taken many, many calls, which we'll continue to do, to describe what's happening out there, what we're doing internally, and then some things that people should be able to do to safeguard out there, working with our specs ops team as well too, and gathering that information. Our global operations center team, you know, so Roland did a great job of describing this. This is the nucleus, the centralized area of focus of all comms, all audit, bringing together the centralized information. And again, if these two things were disparate and siloed, I don't think we'd be where we were today and be able to react to this as well as we did, over the course of the last 10 days and moving forward into the future. And then finally, our product team is working on, more dashboards, more advanced searches out there for our customers to be able to leverage this in their environments, to be able to look at other IOCs that may exist moving forward, because we're not going to see this going away. So continue to patch, to stay up to date with our releases for sure. I'll take a pause there and just see Roland, Girish, if you guys have anything else you want to add to that.
No, just patch, update where you can. You can't understate that. As we go into, from the initial notification, we're at 2.17, right? And we'll probably be on 2.18 in 3 days. Who knows? But patch. I mean, again, it may be a minimal risk, but when you can reduce it by, deploying a basic patch, why not do it, right?
Yeah, so absolutely agree, George and Roland. So one thing I wanted to mention is the product team, our content teams, PM, product management, SEs, and practitioners. Everyone is trying to build additional content that can mitigate how quickly can detect potential attacks. In this thing, we have shared some examples. Just stay tuned as we find more information. This is a live situation, like George mentioned, and we'll continue to update and release more content. And that's a good segue to the next page for George to talk a little bit about the Vulnerability Response Center page as well. Back to you, George.
Yeah, and so again, this is great work. You guys can see the links there. We already clicked through a little bit earlier as well, but as Roland said, patch. But then we also have this Log4j Vulnerability Response Center, which you're going to see, our latest point of view on what's happening. Again, our be brilliant at the basics. So, how we're doing work on those 4 things, we'll have updates there. But more importantly, what you can do, leveraging our product set to go out there and start helping yourself. And this is one of the things we take a lot of pride in, because this is an area of help. This is not like we're pushing product on people at all. Our product does a ton, and we use it internally, again, drinking our own champagne, to work our way through this process. So it's not just about the great work, that Roland and team done, the different playbooks, getting visibility into what a modern day architecture, how they respond to this. It's really about some things that are very, very useful to help you get to that. So, continue to check that out. You can see the links there. And then what's really cool too is that situational awareness brief. That's where Roland was. It gives you those deep dives into those queries and those strings that you should be looking out for as well. Anything to add, guys, before we move on to the next page? Because I'm kind of anxious to get to Q&A, because I see some stuff dropping into the Q&A there.
That's good. The only thing I'll just encourage people to go to sumologic.com/log4j web page. That's the response center, which is more of an informational center for the benefit of everyone.
Cool. Next slide. Okay, so let's open it up to Q&A. I saw one out here, and thank you so much for folks for being able to drop to these in here. There's a ton of them. So we'll get to the ones that we can. Can you paste the links and resources pasted in the chat window? Not able to copy it? Absolutely. So we appreciate that as well too. So they want the links and resources pasted in the chat window, because some folks aren't able to copy that. So if someone can handle that, that would be great.
So George, let's start with an easy one, right? So impacted, affected, vulnerable, exploited. So there's all these different monikers in the industry. And so we don't want to scare anyone, obviously, because we are being transparent here. Can you comment on impacted, affected, vulnerable, exploited?
Sure. I mean, look, so the vulnerable piece, obviously, because we were using Log4j, I think that makes you vulnerable, but not, and you were impacted. We were impacted because the amount of work we had to do to be able to go out, detect, and then come to the assessment, which was nothing was ever exploited, and the risk was minimal. So I think that's a really good question. And the way that we like to describe it internally is, and Roland can talk about this all day long, is event and incident. Whenever we talk about an event, it's something that usually goes to a post-mortem, Where there was really minimal impact, we weren't affected by it at all. Nothing was ever exploited. When we talk about an incident, it's something real. And this was real. This was an incident. But the post-mortem, whenever we're done with it, because we keep on getting to these different stages of it, just like everyone else, what we're finding is the same answer over and over again. And I'm going to knock on wood as I say this, is that we were never exploited to this point. And so I think that that's a really good way to sort of lay it out. And it is a lot of different stuff, but you're always going to get affected by this sort of thing. And it's always going to have impact. But in ours, it was more the due diligence that we've had to do to continually identify where it's at and then patch, just like you. So the main thing I want to focus on here is exploitation. So far, zero, none. We haven't seen us get exploited anywhere yet to date, or our customers get exploited anywhere yet to date. Now, our customers have to do their due diligence on two things. One is patch. We've said that nonstop, and the rest of the industry is saying that. Second one also is leverage the product, leverage some of the queries, some of the strings that we've shared with you here today to be able to go out there and get more proactive about this. So Roland, Girish, I don't know if you guys have anything you want to add to that, but that's my POV.
No, I think that's spot on. And to talk, like you mentioned, I could talk about it all day. And I don't want to do that to anybody.
What else we got, Girish?
Okay, so let's switch context and make it a little bit more interesting. So is there an SLA around CVE 7+ detection? I think what the question is really trying to understand is, can solutions be architected so there is some sort of auto alerting or mitigation capability when it hits a particular CVE threshold?
Well, I mean, I can tell you now, the way we look at it, whenever anything like this happens, the SLA is just immediate. You know, like we did not mess around. When I talk about war rooms, we had, even this weekend, so I can't even remember the weekend before, unfortunately. I'd have to go back and look at the notes, but we had a war room up the whole time. This weekend, starting on Friday, we had, you know, a Zoom channel up where we had folks from our platform as a service team, which is really around our K8s and container deployment, architects within the company in there, our SRE team, you know, out of Poland, and then our GOC. And that war room, no one was going to sleep. And, you know, nobody was going to stop working on these things until we had really taking a look. And one thing that we didn't really talk about here, and I want to make sure we mentioned because some of our customers got this too, was AWS did some notification on Friday saying that they saw some traffic that wasn't normal within our environment that had something to do with Log4j. We take it seriously, you know, and when we want to get a response out in 24 hours, which is what we did. So the question's a good one. I don't think most software companies hold themselves to those standards. When you look at a lot of the other vulnerabilities that have been exploited, a lot of times people stayed quiet about it. That's not our way. You know, like if we were exploited, you'd know, we would tell you. I mean, we have to by nature of our regulatory standards, but it's just something we take a lot of pride in. And so we have this all hands on deck code red type attitude. And fortunately, because we have a follow the sun model, we were able to do some handoffs to give people some rest. You know, so what you saw happen was very late on Friday night, you know, US sort of handed back off to Poland and India, even though some of those folks didn't sleep and stayed on 24 hours. Roland's team was on pretty much 24 hours. Then we did a handoff again on Saturday to start taking a look at this and communicating again. So in my mind, the SLA should always be immediate when you see something this large. We knew, you know, on December 10th, I believe that was the Friday that a lot of this came out. We knew that this was going to be an ongoing thing and that we would have to have like that 24-hour attitude on everything. And we'd like to shorten that.
Right. I recall Roland and I having a conversation of overloading acronyms such as MTTR, mean time to react. I think, Roland, this is a real example, isn't it, sir?
Absolutely, it absolutely is.
Okay, so let's make it interesting. There are some pointed questions. So one of the questions is removing the JNDX class from jar libraries an acceptable patch or workaround. Do we know enough currently to definitively say this?
I'll go first and then Roland, you can go. Like, I think it helps, But at the same time, you just got to accept the fact that you're going to have to patch at some point. That's really where all this is at. And I understand that it's hard. And I understand that it's hard in complex, non-standardized environments like we started off in the beginning, but I think it's a good step. And every step that you can take helps. This sort of reminds me of where we were at, where we were like, hey, you know, we released a collector with a 2.15 on it. The risk is minimal. But we're going to release another collector down the line. And people were like, no, we want the other collector right now, which we ended up getting out within 24 hours, you know, so we were still taking steps, which is what you're talking about here by removing those. But I think ultimately the answer is you got to patch. Roland, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, if I recall, and like you mentioned, it's been fast and heavy since we found out about this thing. I think that's what Apache proposed as a potential workaround. But to your point, the layered approach, you know, we in security world, we hear defense in depth, but that layered approach of patch, like if you can do everything, that's the best approach. And then as you start peeling things off and get closer to just one thing, that's the worst case scenario. That's the last place you want to be. So yes, that's to George's point. Yes, that's a great first step, but kind of compound those steps to get a better or lower risk level.
Thank you, gentlemen. So this is a little bit of a loaded question, but I think this is every CISO or security practitioner's dream question. So the thing is, the industry is still in reactive mode, right? Proactive, reactive, depending on the perspective. Would a risk-based mitigation approach help here? And if so, what would you do differently? This is, I'm adding more to the question, George.
Yeah, I mean, look, it always is about risk and how much effort you put into it. You know, I just still see this as such an unknown that, you know, it's high risk still. And, you know, one of the things that we're discussing internally is, as much as I say that we're leaning into open source and we're always going to lean into open source, is, do we still want to use this for the time being? You know, are we going to replace this from an architecture perspective? And those discussions are going on right now. We're taking a look at the architecture at Sumo, you know, across the board and saying, is it worth it to continue to update these different versions out there, or should we just lean in somewhere else? And so at some point you got to quit reacting. And that's why that's such a good question. Because right now I'm starting to feel like we do have all hands on deck. We do have sense of urgency, but is there something else we can do to where that's not the case? I mean, people need to sleep, people need to move forward. We need to continue to build product, and I'd rather focus on helping our customers. And so the risk-based approach is always a natural thing for every CISO, CIO out there. But at the same time, if we're just constantly reacting to this, and as Roland said, next thing you know, we're pushing out another update around 2.18, it might be time to just say, hey, let's pump the brakes here and maybe replace this thing. Cool. It's fair.
I think we're almost at the top of the hour here, George and Roland. Thank you so much. Wrap up comments back to you, George and Roland.
Yeah, so I'll go first. And one of the things, you know, that we were getting hit up on a lot, and I do want to mention this because it's an interesting conversation. When we did our releases, a lot of people were like, you guys said could be vulnerable. And then they wanted further examples of how we could be vulnerable, made in public. We can't do that. You shouldn't do that either. Like if you start putting too much out there in public about these are the steps to exploit this, guess what's going to happen? And so as a security person, we got to think about it that way. Now, you know, again, the risk was very minimal, but we did see some things early on. And if you ever want to know the details about that, reach out to me, reach out to Roland, reach out to Girish, reach out to your sales team. We'll hop on a call and we're going to walk you through exactly what we see. What we don't want to do is put a roadmap out there to exploitation, you know, to help these folks move along. Because in some cases, and we talked about this a lot internally this weekend, is like, you know, the differences between script kiddies and then hardcore hackers is monumental. A script kid can get a hold of something, you know, delivered by a company like ours or yours that says, this is how we believe you could exploit that. And then all of a sudden they have a roadmap to be able to do this. Obviously a hardcore hacker is always going to be a little bit ahead of this and know a few things, but you don't want to make it easy. You know, security and exploitation is always least path of resistance. And I'll relate it back to physical security. when someone goes into a neighborhood and they want to rob a house, they're going to try to open doors, and a door that's unlocked or a door that doesn't have a bunch of security around it, that's where they're going to go in, is least path of resistance. So let's continue to do best practices in hygiene, and putting out a roadmap to exploitation just isn't a good thing. Roland, any final thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. All the resources that, if I'm not mistaken, Garish posted in the chat or in the Q&A, absolutely use those, and even more, like you alluded to at the beginning of the webinar. Let's just make sure we continue to prop each other up, provide support, share information, because that's the only thing we're going to get. Only we're going to get through this thing. Towards one of the questions that were in the Q&A. Is this the end to Log4j vulnerabilities? The answer is no. It's just not. It's not. So we have to continue propping each other up, making sure we can all get through this together, whether friend or competitor. It's one fight, again, like George mentioned, good and bad at this point. Let's all work together.
All right, folks, George, Roland, and the entire community that helped and rallied around creating a proper timely response. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Roland, if you don't mind hitting the next slide. The other thing you can do as well too is just, any further questions, or you want to talk privately, just DM me on Twitter. I'll get back to you. Because Roland said this is one community, one fight, and we should all take a close look and use product like ours to check out your open source library for sure. So thank you everyone for joining. Appreciate it.